He had spoken to no one for 3 months, but when 3 desperate women appeared at his gate with children clinging to their skirts, everything Thaddeus Crow thought he knew about solitude was about to shatter. The sun hung merciless overhead when the sound reached him. Voices, real human voices, cutting through the silence that had wrapped around his ranch like a thick blanket for years. Thaddeus dropped the hammer he'd been using to repair the fence and squinted toward the main road. 3 figures moved slowly up the dusty path, their shadows long and wavering in the heat. He hadn't seen another soul since the supply run to town back in spring. Now here they were, 3 women walking toward his property with small children trailing behind them. The youngest girl, barely more than a toddler, stumbled in the dirt and immediately started crying. One of the women scooped her up without breaking stride. Thaddeus felt his chest tighten. People meant complications. People meant questions he didn't want to answer, and conversations he'd forgotten how to have. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle leaning against the fence post, not out of threat, but out of habit. Strangers didn't just wander onto his land by accident. The lead woman had dark hair escaping from a faded bonnet. Her dress, once probably blue, had been worn to a dusty gray. She walked with purpose despite the exhaustion clear in her shoulders. The other 2 flanked her, one carrying what looked like a small bundle of cloth, the other holding the hand of a boy who couldn't be more than 8 years old. As they drew closer, Thaddeus could see the desperation etched into their faces. These weren't travelers passing through or neighbors making social calls. These were people running from something, haunted by shadows he could almost feel. The woman in front raised her hand in greeting, but her smile was strained, almost pleading. "Sir," she called out when she was close enough to be heard without shouting, "we don't mean any trouble. We just need to speak with you for a moment." Thaddeus remained motionless by his fence. 20 yards separated them now, close enough for him to see the dirt caked on their clothes, the deep exhaustion wringing their eyes, the way the children pressed close to their mother's legs, seeking reassurance. The little girl had stopped crying, but her face was streaked with tears and dust. The woman took another step forward. "My name is Clarabelle. These are my friends, Mercy and Violet. We've been walking since dawn and we—" She paused, glancing back at the children, then met his eyes again. "We need help." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken fears. Thaddeus felt something twist in his stomach, a feeling he'd worked hard to bury years ago. Responsibility, the weight of someone else's problems pressing down on him like a stone. He'd built this life specifically to avoid moments like this, to insulate himself from the world and its inevitable hardships. But as he looked at the 3 women standing in the heat with their children, as he saw the way the boy protectively positioned himself between his mother and this strange man, as he noticed how the youngest girl's legs trembled with fatigue, Thaddeus realized that some choices make themselves. That even in the vast emptiness of his self-imposed exile, he couldn't escape the pull of human compassion. He was about to speak when Clarabelle added quietly, "We just need somewhere safe to spend the night. We can't keep walking with the children." That's when Thaddeus saw what she was really asking for, and what terrified him most was that he was already considering saying yes. For 15 years, no one had stepped foot inside Thaddeus Crow's house, but when he opened that door and gestured them in, he knew he was letting in more than just 3 women and their children. He was letting in chaos, a disruption to the carefully constructed order he had maintained for so long. The silence inside his home felt suddenly fragile, like glass about to break. The women entered hesitantly, their children pressed close behind them, wide-eyed and wary. The boy, Mercy's son, kept his eyes fixed on Thaddeus with a weariness that reminded him too much of himself at that age, a premature understanding of the world's cruelties. "Sit anywhere you like," Thaddeus said, then immediately regretted it. Where exactly were they supposed to sit? The parlor had one chair and a wooden bench he'd built years ago, but never used, symbols of a life he had abandoned. The dust motes danced in the afternoon light streaming through windows that hadn't been opened in months, painting the room in a melancholic glow. Clarabelle settled onto the bench, pulling the youngest girl onto her lap. The child's thumb found its way to her mouth as she stared around the room with wide eyes, taking in the Spartan surroundings. Mercy remained standing, one protective hand on her son's shoulder, while Violet clutched her small bundle of belongings against her chest, her knuckles white. "You said you've been walking since dawn," Thaddeus said, leaning against the doorframe because sitting felt too intimate, too much like accepting that this was really happening, that his solitude was truly breached. "Where did you come from?" The three women exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. Clarabelle spoke first. "We were staying in a boarding house about 20 miles east, but the situation became difficult." "Difficult how?" Another pause, thick with unspoken dread. This time it was Mercy who answered, her voice tight with controlled anger. "The man who ran it decided we owed him more than just money for our rooms. When we refused to pay his price, he said we had until morning to find another arrangement." Thaddeus felt his jaw clench. He'd known men like that. Men who saw desperation as opportunity, who preyed on women with nowhere else to go, leeches feeding on the vulnerable. "So you left?" "We had to," Violet said quietly, her voice barely audible. "We heard about your ranch from a woman in town. She said you lived alone, that you kept to yourself, but weren't the kind of man who would hurt us." The weight of that statement settled over the room, heavy and suffocating. These women had walked 20 miles on the word of a stranger, hoping that another stranger might show them kindness, a testament to the depths of their desperation. The youngest girl, Clarabelle's daughter, slipped down from her mother's lap and wandered toward the fireplace. She pointed at the cold ashes and looked back at him with curious eyes. "Fire's been out for weeks," Thaddeus said. "Haven't needed it." "When did you last cook a proper meal?" Clarabelle asked, and there was something in her voice that made him look at her more closely. Not judgment, but genuine concern, a flicker of warmth in the cold landscape of his life. "I eat fine." "I'm sure you do." But her eyes had already catalogued the empty shelves, the thin layer of dust on everything, the way he stood apart from them like contact might burn him. "When did you last have company?" The question hit harder than it should have, a sharp reminder of the void he had created. Thaddeus found himself remembering the sound of laughter in this room, the smell of bread baking, the feeling of coming home to voices and warmth and life, ghosts of a past he had tried to bury. Then he pushed those memories down where they belonged, deep into the darkness. "I don't have company," he said simply. Mercy's son tugged on his mother's sleeve and whispered something Thaddeus couldn't hear. She nodded and looked back at him. "Samuel wants to know if you have any food. The children haven't eaten since yesterday morning." Yesterday morning. Thaddeus felt something crack inside his chest. These women had been walking for over a day with hungry children, hoping to find someone who wouldn't turn them away. And they'd chosen him. "I'll fix something," he said, moving toward the kitchen, a long dormant instinct stirring within him. "You all just make yourselves comfortable." But as he reached for the pantry door, Clarabelle's voice stopped him. "Mr. Crow, there's something else we need to tell you, something about why we really had to leave so quickly." Thaddeus turned back to face them, already knowing that whatever she was about to say would make everything more complicated, that the fragile peace he had clung to was about to be shattered. And as he looked at the three women huddled in his dusty parlor with their tired children, he realized that the person he'd been protecting all these years by living alone was about to face his greatest test. Because sometimes the thing you're running from finds you anyway, and sometimes it comes wearing the face of people who need your help. The truth hit Thaddeus like a physical blow, but it wasn't what Clarabelle told him about their past that shattered his carefully constructed walls. It was what she said about his own, the uncomfortable reflection she held up to his carefully curated solitude. "The boarding house owner wasn't just demanding money," Clarabelle continued, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "He said he knew men who would pay good money for women like us, women with children and nowhere to go. He gave us until sunrise to decide." Thaddeus felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had driven him to this isolated place 15 years ago. Men who preyed on the desperate, men who saw vulnerability as profit, the wolves in sheep's clothing that had haunted his life. His hands clenched into fists before he forced them to relax, knowing that violence wouldn't solve anything. Not this time. "That's not all," Mercy added quietly. "He sent someone after us. A man on horseback passed us about an hour ago, riding toward town. We hid in the brush until he was gone, but he was asking questions at every house, looking for 3 women with children." The weight of their situation settled over the room like a heavy blanket, smothering the air. These women weren't just seeking shelter for the night, they were hiding. And by helping them, Thaddeus was making himself part of whatever danger followed them, drawing him into a conflict he had desperately tried to avoid. But then Clarabelle said something that changed everything, a revelation that pierced through his carefully constructed defenses. "The woman who told us about you," she said, "your name was Thaddeus Crow. She said you'd lost your own family years ago, and that's why you lived alone." She paused, studying his face, searching for a flicker of recognition, a spark of humanity. "She said you'd understand what it meant to protect children." The room went deadly quiet. Even the children seemed to sense the shift in the air, the unspoken emotions hanging heavy in the atmosphere. Thaddeus felt his carefully maintained composure cracking, memories he'd buried clawing their way to the surface. Sarah's laugh, little Emma chasing butterflies in the yard, the fever that took them both in a matter of days while he was away selling cattle, a grief that had consumed him whole. "She had no right to tell you that," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, a raw expression of pain. "Maybe not," Clarabelle replied gently, her eyes filled with a profound understanding. "But she was right, wasn't she? You do understand." Thaddeus turned away, staring out the window at the vast emptiness he'd chosen over human connection, the self-imposed prison he had built around his heart. The loneliness had been his penance, his way of ensuring he'd never again have to watch helplessly as the people he cared about suffered, a futile attempt to control the uncontrollable. But now these strangers were asking him to care again, to risk again, to choose their safety over his own carefully guarded peace, to open himself up to the possibility of further heartbreak. The youngest girl, Violet's daughter, had wandered over to a dusty shelf where an old wooden horse sat forgotten. Emma's horse, the one he'd carved for her 4th birthday, just weeks before the fever came, a tangible reminder of his lost joy. The little girl reached for it with chubby fingers, then looked up at him with eyes that were heartbreakingly familiar, mirroring the innocence he had failed to protect. "Can I play with this?" she asked in a whisper, her voice filled with a fragile hope. Thaddeus stared at the toy he hadn't touched in 15 years, at the child who looked so much like his own daughter that it made his chest ache, a wound reopening with agonizing clarity. Behind him, he could hear the mothers holding their breath, waiting to see if he would share even this small piece of his past, if he would finally allow himself to feel again. Before he could answer, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from outside, fast, urgent, getting closer, shattering the fragile peace. Mercy moved to the window and peered through the dusty glass. When she turned back, her face was pale, etched with fear. Someone's coming, riding hard up the main road. Thaddeus felt everything inside him go cold, a familiar dread washing over him. The choice he'd been wrestling with was about to be made for him, because whether he wanted it or not, the danger these women were running from had just found them all, and he was no longer just a bystander. The rider wasn't alone, and when Thaddeus saw who was with him, he realized these women had brought more than just danger to his door. They'd brought his own past back to life, forcing him to confront the demons he had tried to bury. "Get the children to the back room," Thaddeus said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that made all 3 women move without question, a primal instinct taking over. "Stay quiet until I tell you otherwise." Through the window, he watched 2 men dismount near his gate. The first was a stranger, lean and predatory, with the kind of eyes that calculated profit and human misery, a predator sizing up his prey. But the second man made Thaddeus's blood run cold, older, thicker around the middle, with graying hair and a badge that caught the afternoon light. Sheriff Marcus Cale, the same lawman who'd stood in this very room 15 years ago, explaining why he couldn't investigate the doctor who'd refused to treat a poor man's family during the fever outbreak. The same man who'd taken money to look the other way while decent people died, a symbol of the corruption that had plagued his life. Thaddeus grabbed his rifle from beside the door and stepped onto the porch. The weapon wasn't aimed at anyone, but its presence sent a clear message. This was his land, and visitors weren't welcome, a line drawn in the sand. "Thaddeus Crow," Sheriff Cale called out, his voice carrying false friendliness, a veneer of civility masking the darkness beneath. "Been a long time." "Not long enough." Thaddeus kept his tone flat, neutral, masking the turmoil within. "State your business." The lean man stepped forward, all confidence and sharp edges, radiating a palpable sense of menace. "Name's Garrett. I'm looking for 3 women who ran off with something that doesn't belong to them. We tracked them this direction. Haven't seen anyone." "See, now that's interesting," Garrett said, walking closer despite the rifle, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Because we followed their tracks right up to your gate. Funny how they just disappeared." Inside the house, Thaddeus could hear muffled whispers as the women tried to keep the children quiet. A floorboard creaked. Violet's daughter started to cry before being quickly hushed. The sounds were soft, but in the tense silence, they carried like gunshots, betraying their presence. Sheriff Cale smiled, the expression cold and calculating, a predator sensing weakness. "Sounds like you've got company, Thaddeus. Mind if we come in and say hello?" "I mind plenty. This is private property." Now, the sheriff said, his hand resting casually on his gun, a subtle threat. "We're just looking for some missing property. 3 women who took something valuable from Mr. Garrett's establishment, nothing more than a friendly conversation." Thaddeus felt rage building in his chest, a slow burn that threatened to consume him. Property. They were calling these women property. And Cale was helping them, just like he'd helped other predators 15 years ago when money changed hands and justice looked the other way, perpetuating the cycle of abuse. "The only conversation I'm interested in," Thaddeus said, raising his rifle slightly, his voice laced with steel, "is the one where you explain why you're on my land without invitation." Garrett's mask slipped for a moment, revealing the violence underneath, the animalistic rage that drove him. "Those women belong to me. They have debts to pay, obligations to fulfill. I'm not leaving without them." "The hell you're not." The 2 men exchanged glances, a silent assessment of the situation. Thaddeus could see them calculating odds, weighing their options, 2 against 1. But he had the higher ground and better cover. More importantly, he had something they didn't. A reason to fight that went deeper than money, a burning desire to protect the innocent. Inside the house, one of the children whispered something that carried through the thin walls. Samuel's voice, young and scared. "Mama, is the bad man going to find us?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, a plea for protection. Thaddeus thought about Emma, about how she'd clung to him during those final fevered nights, how helpless he'd felt watching her suffer while men like these decided that some lives mattered less than others. A memory that fueled his resolve. Sheriff Cale took a step toward the porch. "Thaddeus, you don't want to make this harder than it needs to be. These are dangerous women thieves. They've probably already robbed you blind." "The only thieves I see," Thaddeus said, his voice deadly quiet, "are standing in my yard." That's when Garrett's hand moved toward his gun, and Thaddeus realized that 15 years of hiding from the world hadn't prepared him for this moment. Because some fights, once they start, don't end until someone doesn't get up, and the stakes had just been raised. And with 3 mothers and their children depending on him, Thaddeus Crow was about to discover exactly what kind of man he still was, whether he could overcome the ghosts of his past and embrace the possibility of redemption. The first shot shattered more than just the afternoon silence. It shattered the last 15 years of Thaddeus Crow's carefully constructed isolation, forcing him to become the man he'd buried with his family, the protector he thought he could never be again. Garrett's hand had barely cleared leather when Thaddeus's rifle barked. The bullet splintered the fence post inches from the stranger's head, sending him diving for cover behind his horse, adrenaline pumping through his veins. Sheriff Cale drew his weapon, but hesitated, clearly not expecting armed resistance from a man he remembered as broken and defeated, a miscalculation that could cost him dearly. "Next one won't be the warning," Thaddeus called out, working the bolt on his rifle, the sound echoing across the yard. "Get off my land." From inside the house came the sound of children crying, quickly muffled by their mothers' hands. Thaddeus felt each sob like a knife in his chest, remembering another child's cries that he'd been powerless to stop, a pain that resonated deep within his soul. But not this time. This time he could do something. He had a chance to make a difference. "You're making a big mistake, Crow," Sheriff Cale shouted, using his horse as cover. "Those women are criminals. Harboring them makes you one too." "Then arrest me," Thaddeus replied, his voice unwavering. "Come up here and put me in chains. I'm waiting." The challenge hung in the air between them, a gauntlet thrown down. Cale had the law on his side, but laws meant nothing when you were staring down the barrel of a rifle held by a man with nothing left to lose, and that's exactly what Thaddeus had become. A man who'd already lost everything that mattered, a force to be reckoned with. Garrett popped up from behind his horse, pistol in hand. "I've got $50 for each of those women, Crow. That's more money than you've seen in years. All you have to do is walk away." "Counteroffer," Thaddeus said, swinging his rifle toward the voice, his eyes narrowed with focus. "You ride out now, and I don't put a hole in you big enough to drive a wagon through." Inside the house, he heard Clarabelle's voice, soft but urgent, trying to calm the children. The sound of it reminded him so sharply of Sarah comforting Emma during thunderstorms that his chest ached, a longing for a life that could never be again. These women weren't just hiding in his house. They were depending on him, trusting him, believing he could protect them the way he'd failed to protect his own family, a responsibility he couldn't shirk. Sheriff Cale tried a different approach, attempting to undermine Thaddeus's resolve. "Thaddeus, think about what you're doing. These women have filled your head with lies. They're not innocent victims. They ran off owing money." The word hit Thaddeus like a physical blow, not because he believed it, but because of how casually Cale dismissed 3 human beings, just like he dismissed Sarah and Emma all those years ago. Just property, just problems, just people who didn't matter, a callous disregard for human life that fueled his anger. "Sheriff," Thaddeus said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried across the yard, "you've got 10 seconds to decide if you're leaving on your horse or over it." That's when Clarabelle made a decision that changed everything, a bold move that defied his protection. The front door opened behind him and she stepped onto the porch, her hands visible, but her chin raised defiantly, a symbol of her unwavering courage. "Mr. Garrett," she called out, "you want to talk to us? Then talk, but you leave this man out of it." Thaddeus felt panic surge through him, a desperate need to protect her. "Get back inside!" But Clarabelle shook her head, her eyes locked on Garrett. No more running, no more hiding. She looked down at him with eyes that held more courage than he'd seen in 15 years, a strength that humbled him. Some fights are worth having. If you were Thaddeus, what would you do? Let Clarabelle face the danger to protect her from a lifetime of running, or force her back inside, knowing it might mean they'd never stop hunting her? The riders cresting the hill were about to turn this dangerous situation into something far worse, and in the middle of it all stood 3 women who'd already lost everything once, betting their lives on a lonely rancher's ability to keep them safe. The riders who appeared weren't reinforcements for either side. They were something far more dangerous. Witnesses, and what they witnessed would force Thaddeus to make the hardest choice of his life. 5 men rode up the path, their leader a grizzled rancher Thaddeus recognized from town, Wade McKinley, a man who commanded respect throughout the territory, a pillar of the community. Behind him rode 4 of his hands, all armed, all taking in the scene with sharp eyes that missed nothing, assessing the situation with practiced ease. "Well, well," McKinley said, dismounting slowly, his voice calm but firm. "Sheriff Cale, what brings the law to Thaddeus Crow's ranch?" Cale lowered his weapon slightly, clearly calculating how this new development affected his plans, the arrival of an impartial observer complicating his agenda. "Official business, Wade. These women are fugitives from justice." "Funny," McKinley replied, studying the 3 women on the porch, his gaze sharp and perceptive. They look like mothers protecting their children to me." His gaze shifted to Garrett, his expression hardening. "And you are?" "Garrett. I represent the Riverside boarding house. These women violated their contracts and stole property when they fled." McKinley's expression hardened. "Riverside? That's the place the preacher's been talking about in town, the one where women disappear and nobody asks questions." He looked back at Cale with disgust, his disappointment palpable. "You're helping him?" The sheriff's confidence began to waver, the weight of McKinley's disapproval heavy on his shoulders. Wade McKinley wasn't just any rancher. He was respected, influential, and most importantly, honest, a man of integrity. Having him as a witness changed everything, exposing the corruption at play. "The law is the law," Cale said weakly, his voice lacking conviction. "Whose law?" McKinley shot back, his eyes blazing with righteous anger. "The kind that protects women and children, or the kind that sells them to the highest bidder?" Thaddeus felt a surge of hope, a glimmer of light in the darkness. For the first time in 15 years, he wasn't fighting alone. But that hope died when Garrett pulled a second gun and pointed it directly at little Samuel, shattering the fragile peace. "Enough talk," Garrett snarled, his voice dripping with malice. "These women come with me now, or the boy pays the price." The world went deadly silent, the air thick with tension. Samuel stood frozen, his young face pale with terror, his eyes wide with fear. Mercy started forward but stopped when Garrett swung the gun toward her, his intent clear. "One step closer and I paint this porch with his blood," Garrett warned, his grip tightening on the trigger. McKinley's men reached for their weapons, ready to intervene, but Garrett shook his head, a chilling smile playing on his lips. 7 armed men against 1 desperate businessman. I like my odds better when I've got insurance. That's when Thaddeus understood the true cost of protecting others, the agonizing dilemma he now faced. It wasn't just about being willing to die. It was about being willing to watch innocents suffer for your choices. The same helplessness he'd felt watching Emma slip away from fever now threatened to destroy him again, a pain he couldn't bear to relive. But Clarabelle stepped forward, placing herself between Garrett and the boy, a selfless act of courage. "Take me. Leave the children and take me. I'll go willingly if you promise to let them stay here safely." "All 3 of you or the boy dies," Garrett replied coldly, his eyes devoid of emotion. Mercy moved to stand beside Clarabelle. What was the right thing to do? So, in the end, Thaddeus is faced with an impossible choice, a stark reminder that even in the most isolated corners of the world, compassion and the fight for what's right will always find you. It's a powerful message about the enduring strength of the human spirit, the courage it takes to choose kindness in the face of overwhelming darkness, and the fact that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with weapons, but with the unwavering choice to protect those who need it most. What do you think Thaddeus will do? I'd love to hear your thoughts, theories, or even just your initial reactions in the comments below. Do you have any questions about the characters or the situation? Let's discuss it. And if you enjoyed this and want to see what happens next, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any updates. We'll be diving deeper into this story, exploring Thaddeus's past and uncovering the secrets these women are hiding. Thanks for watching.